Hello, U.S. history students. So, we're working our way through the American Civil War, and this lesson is going to deal with some key people, some key personalities from the war. Now, I'll be honest with you, there are a bunch of people that we could talk about, a bunch of people I would like to talk about, but these are kind of the top three on both sides, okay? If I had my time, we talk about George McClellan, who was a general for the Union, and in my opinion, a big failure, but that's okay. So we're just going to hit three people on both sides. We're going to talk about both presidents and then two key generals. Okay. So we're going to start with the Union first, the North, and of course we can't talk about the Civil War and not mention this guy right here, Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809 in Kentucky, in a log cabin. In fact, if you go to Kentucky, you can visit Lincoln Birthplace National Historic Site and see a replica of the cabin that he was born in. Okay, it is not the original one. It has some of the original material, they think, but it is a reconstruction on the site where that cabin was. Now, what's interesting is Kentucky is a border state. Kentucky had slavery. Okay. Now, Lincoln and his family, they move a couple places. He moves out of Kentucky, he moves to Indiana, and then eventually is in Illinois. And of course, Illinois is a free state. Lincoln was not very educated. By his own admission, if you took the number of days he actually went to school, they would total up to about a year. Okay. And all the years of schooling that he had, they might total up to a year. He was largely self-taught. Okay, he did love to read. He did love learning. His stepmother, his first mother passed away from an illness. His father remarries. His stepmother really encouraged Lincoln and his education and thought it was very, very important. In fact, I think his father was technically illiterate. I'll have to go back and double check that. But his stepmother really, really encouraged Lincoln and his education. All right. So one of the reasons I like Lincoln is he is not born into wealth or success. His father was a farmer. He helps his dad splitting wood and things like that. And to be honest with you, his relationship with his father is not that good, but he picks himself up by his bootstraps, so to say, and becomes this great politician, in my humble opinion. Okay, so that's part of the reason I like Lincoln is he overcomes a lot and he works hard and gets to the position that he's in. At the same time, I really think he tries to value people and to work with people because we've talked about one of his goals is to preserve the Union. All right. And part of his skill as a president is his ability to take this presidential cabinet, which was full of a bunch of people that did not like him, and get them to work together. So Lincoln, one of my favorite people, definitely my favorite president. All right. So he comes from this very, very impoverished childhood. He does become a lawyer. Okay. In fact, he goes through a series of jobs. He's a store owner. He becomes a lawyer. He's actually good as a lawyer. And through his work in law, he gets interested in politics, especially the new political party, the Republican Party. Okay. He used to be a Whig. That party dies off and he joins the Republican Party. Now, I've been telling you guys in class and maybe in some of the other um, lessons, I gave you the wrong date. 1858 is when he runs for that U.S. Senate seat against Stephen Douglas. We talked about that a couple, in the last unit with Lincoln and Douglas and Scott. We've mentioned it before. So he runs 1858 against Stephen Douglas for the Senate seat. Douglas is popular sovereignty. He believes the people should decide whether or not slavery is in their territory or not. Lincoln, anti-slavery. He does not want to see slavery spread. Douglas is going to win that Senate seat in 1858. Lincoln, though, is going to be the rising star in the Republican Party. And in 1860, he runs for president on the Republican ticket. And of course, he wins that election. He becomes president of the United States. That's going to lead to South Carolina seceding, and that's going to set the ball rolling for the Civil War. Like we talked about in the last lesson about the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln is opposed to slavery. He does not like slavery. He does not want to see it spread. He would like to see it ended, but at the same time, he's not sure he has the power to do anything about it just yet. And we talked about the evolution of that as the war goes on. He is the only U.S. president during the Civil War. Okay, there is no he wins in 1860. There's another election in 1864, and he wins re-election in 1864. It is a very hard fought election. In fact, there are times that he thinks he's not going to win. There are some Northern Democrats that are ready to end the war and propose peace with the South. And Lincoln says, no, we've got to preserve the country. In fact, that is his main goal fighting the war in the beginning, is we've got to preserve the Union at all costs. And we've been through 4 years of war already. We can't give up now. And in 1864, he's not sure he's going to win because there is this peace delegation that is very, very prominent in the North. Okay, this peace party is very, very prominent in the North. But he ends up winning the election in 1864 and goes on to serve as president for the rest of the war. Okay. He issues the Emancipation Proclamation following the Battle of Antietam. We talked about that, which condemns slavery. It's supposed to free the slaves in the South. We talked about that. It really doesn't, because the South doesn't pay attention to him, and it doesn't free any slaves in the North. But at the same time, it is paving the way for what he wants to do later on once the war is won, which is namely free the slaves. And we talked about the strategic value. It keeps the British and the French out of the war on the side of the Confederacy. It gives the North another reason to fight. It gives abolitionists another reason to fight. It brings African Americans into the war so they can fight for freedom. All kinds of benefits because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln will be assassinated at the end of the war. The war ends on April the 9th, 1865. Technically ends April the 9th, 1865, with the surrender of Lee to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. 5 days later, and we're going to talk more about this next week when we get to the end of the war, he's assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater on April the 14th, 1865. Okay. Lincoln was married. He was married to a lady by the name of Mary Todd. Mary Todd, when she stood beside Lincoln, Mary Todd was very kind of short. Also, in my humble opinion, a little plump. Lincoln very, very tall, very, very thin. So they made an interesting couple when they stood side by side. He had 4 sons. All right. Robert Todd Lincoln, who was the oldest. He's the only Lincoln child to survive to adulthood. All right. And Robert Todd Lincoln ended up having to confine his mother to an insane asylum for part of her life after Lincoln passes away. So interesting family dynamic. So Robert Todd Lincoln is the oldest son. You had Edward Baker Lincoln, who was next. Eddie died when he was a little boy. Very, very sad. Then you had William Wallace Lincoln, or Willie. Willie is going to die when Lincoln is president. Okay, he catches fever, and the fever gets worse, and infection sets in, pneumonia sets in, and Willie Lincoln will die in the White House when Lincoln is president. Okay, 1862, 1863 is when Willie passes away. And then Thomas Lincoln, or Tad, as he is called. Tad is the youngest. Tad is the apple of his father's eye. In fact, there are several reports in the White House that Tad gets away with all kinds of things. Tad and Willie get away with all kinds of mischief in the White House. Okay, but after Willie dies, Lincoln becomes very, very close to Tad as his youngest son. Before he marries Mary Todd, Lincoln was also engaged to a woman by the name of Anne Rutledge, who is very, very close to Anne, also gets sick and dies, and Lincoln is torn apart. He writes a poem called Suicide. His friends are worried about him. They're worried he will actually commit suicide, but he overcomes his grief and marries Mary Todd eventually, and goes on to become president of the United States. So just a man who has overcome a lot and a lot of tragedy, and then holds the country together only to die at the end of this conflict known as the Civil War. Right? So that's Abraham Lincoln in a nutshell. Again, I could go into much more detail about him, but that's Lincoln really, really quick. Lincoln's number one general is a man by the name of Ulysses S. Grant. Okay? Ulysses S. Grant is from Ohio. He was born in 1822. He enters West Point, which is the United States Military Academy, the Army. Okay, had a abysmal record at West Point. A lot of demerits. Demerits are what happens and you get in trouble when you do something wrong. In fact, if you get so many demerits, you can get kicked out. All right, and Grant, I think, was very, very close to getting kicked out of the Army. He serves with distinction, though, in the Mexican-American War. Okay, and gains the attention of his superior officers. He has also had difficulty with jobs and keeping a job. He goes through several jobs early on in his career. Also, interestingly enough, Ulysses S. Grant owns a couple of slaves. Okay, so he fights for the North, but he owns a couple of slaves. They were a wedding present from his father-in-law. And Grant is on record as saying, now he will eventually free his slaves and he will eventually embrace the abolitionist movement. But Grant is on record saying early on, if he thought the war was just about slavery, he probably would have fought for the South. Okay. But he doesn't. He fights for the North. And it's a good thing that he does. He enters the war as a brigadier general. Okay, and becomes known for aggressive and bold tactics. He realizes what a lot of other Union generals don't, that the Union has the numbers. It's got a lot of soldiers, it's got a lot of supplies, it's got a lot of railroads, it's got the numbers. It will eventually win, but it might take a while. Okay, so he's very, very aggressive. He's very, very bold because he knows no matter how many soldiers he loses, he can replace them. Okay. Now, he first serves in the Western Theater around the Mississippi. He's going to be the victor at the Battle of Vicksburg in July 1863. He is the victor at the Battle of Shiloh, which is in Tennessee. He attacks Fort Donelson and Fort Henry on the Mississippi and wins at both of those battles. So he is a shining star in the Union Army. He gets the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant because of his bold tactics and his aggressive nature. When the Confederates come to surrender to him and they ask, "What are your terms?" Grant says, "Unconditional surrender. You surrender now, and then we will talk about what you get and things like that. But right now, you surrender." So he gets the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant, which also fits nicely with his initials. Okay, he is Ulysses S. Grant, U.S. Grant, Unconditional Surrender Grant. Okay, also, fun fact, his middle initial S really doesn't stand for anything. Sometimes biographies have it listed as Simpson, but there is no concrete evidence that was actually his middle name. All right. Honestly, one of the stories is one of his friends said, you ought to, if you don't have a middle initial, you ought to think about S, like U.S. Grant, like United States Grant. Okay, kind of like if you know Joe Theismann, his friends said, "Why don't you call yourself Theismann?" That's not his real last name because Theismann rhymes with Heisman, and he was a Heisman Trophy winner. So, again, another tangent. I'm sorry. So, Grant is a very aggressive and bold commander. He gets this nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. He is very, very successful in the Western Theater around Mississippi. He gains the attention of Lincoln. Lincoln has a series of bad commanders in the Eastern Theater. So he will bring Grant west, or bring Grant from the west to the east in 1864 and make him general in chief of the entire Union Army because he is so successful after others have failed. Now, real quickly, in terms of Army organization, you have the general in chief who's in charge of everything. Then underneath him, you have other generals that are in charge of separate armies. Like one of the big Union armies is the Army of the Potomac. That is the army that Lincoln had the most difficult time with. George McClellan was in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Great organizer. George McClellan, however, would not use the army. Okay, he would line up for battle, He was constantly in fear that Lee had greater numbers than him. So McClellan would get ready to fight. He would see Lee, he would get scared, and he would back off. Okay. McClellan is replaced by a man by the name of Ambrose Burnside. Burnside is where we get the term sideburns from because he had very, very bushy whiskers. Um, Burnside, good commander. However, Burnside cannot deviate from the plan. Okay, he has a good plan at the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862, but through a series of problems, that plan is not going to be successful, and Burnside cannot deviate from the plan, and the Union Army ends up losing bad at Fredericksburg. Burnside is replaced by General Joseph Hooker. Fun fact about Hooker, and this is true, Hooker had a lot of ladies that followed him around. Okay. The camps, they were known as Hooker's ladies. And eventually we just drop the ladies part and they are known as hookers. That's where we get that terminology. Okay. Hooker, also not a very, very successful commander. He was the commander during the Battle of Chancellorsville. A cannonball came through his headquarters, and he kind of gets a little frightened by that. So he is going to be replaced by George Meade. Meade will win at the Battle of Gettysburg. Meade will stay in charge of the Army of the Potomac for the rest of the war, but Grant will come over, and Grant will be in charge of Meade. Okay, so Grant is the total general in chief of all the Union Army. Meade is subordinate to him, and Meade is controlling the Army of the Potomac. Okay, it will be Grant that receives the surrender of Robert E. Lee in April 1865. Okay, Lee will surrender to Grant after the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, April the 9th, 1865. After the war, Grant goes on to become president. He is not known as a very successful president. Part of the reason that is because his cabinet is corrupt. And Grant often takes the blame because he says, I'm commander in chief, I'm the president. Grant often takes the blame for a lot of the things that his subordinates do. So his presidency is not very, very spectacular, although he will serve 2 terms. Okay. He is also known for smoking cigars. And there is a rumor about him that he is constantly drunk in battle. That's probably not the case. All right. And even if it was, Lincoln said, I wish I knew what he was drinking, because if I did, I would send a case to all of my generals and maybe we would win this thing. Okay. Because Grant was so aggressive and bold. Okay. So that's General Grant. One of Grant's most ablest subordinates in the war is William T. Sherman. Okay, William T. Sherman, also from Ohio. He was born in 1820 in Ohio. Also goes to West Point. Okay, and enters the Army as a second lieutenant. He will also serve in the Mexican-American War. He is strongly opposed to secession and warns of the horrors the South will experience during the Civil War. And that's very, very important for what Grant sends him to do. Okay, he commands the 13th U.S. Infantry during the Civil War. He works very, very closely with Grant. Grant gives him a job. Sherman can take care of it, no problem. Okay. Grant sends him from the west to the east across the state of Georgia. And remember, I told you Sherman was opposed to secession, and he says, "I'm going to make Georgia howl." And this basically what happens is he starts in Atlanta. He burns Atlanta to the ground. He sets off from Atlanta to Savannah. Savannah's on the coast. This is his famous March to the Sea. And all along the way, it is a war of aggression. It's total war. He destroys everything that the South could possibly use against him. Okay, not against him, but anything the South could use in the war effort, he destroys. Okay, he rips up the railroads. He heats up the iron parts of the tracks in the railroads and has them bent around trees so that when they cool, they're tied around the tree. Okay, they're known as Sherman neckties. So he invades Georgia. He burns Atlanta to the ground, heads to Savannah, which is on the coast, and burns everything in his path. Okay, he will reach Savannah in December 1864. and he telegrams Abraham Lincoln and says, "I present to you the city of Savannah as a Christmas gift." Okay. Then he's going to begin to move north, headed up to Virginia to hook up with Grant because Grant is heading toward Richmond, and the idea is to capture the Confederate capital and end the war. Okay, Sherman is moving through the Carolinas by the time Richmond falls. All right. Now, what's interesting is despite his reputation as being aggressive and despite the fact that he goes on this campaign of total war in Georgia and things like that, Confederate General Joseph Johnston will surrender to General Grant. Confederate General Joseph Johnston will surrender to Sherman. Lee surrenders to Grant. Johnston surrenders to Sherman. Sherman's surrender terms are much more lenient than Grant's, and Grant's were great. Okay, we'll talk about this when we get to Appomattox, but Grant allowed the Confederate Army to go home with their horses. He allowed them to take their sidearms with them because he knew they would need to go hunting for food. He opens up Union supplies to give to the Confederates and things like that. Sherman does the same thing and goes above and beyond that. So even though you have this gentleman who is known for these aggressive tactics, at the end of the war, he is very, very lenient to the Confederates because Grant believes this, Sherman believes this, Lee believes this, Lincoln believes this. At the end of the war, we need to come back together as a country and move forward together. Okay? Sherman's tactic is to get the South to surrender and come back in. And then once we do that, we can move forward together as a country. Okay? Now we're going to switch gears and we're going to look at the Confederate leadership. All right. And just like we started with Abraham Lincoln, for the Union side, we're going to start with Jefferson Davis on the Confederate side. Davis, very, very close in age to Lincoln. Both of them were born in Kentucky. Davis was born a year earlier than Lincoln in 1808. All right. We talked about this a little bit in class. He went to West Point. Served during the Black Hawk War, served during the Mexican-American War, became Secretary of War for President Franklin Pierce, and then later goes on to serve in both the House and the Senate from the state of Mississippi. Because of his political background and because of his military background, he will become president of the Confederacy in 1861. He will become president of the Confederacy in 1860. Originally, the capital was in Alabama. In 1861, he will move the presidency to Richmond. Richmond will become the new capital of the Confederacy once Virginia secedes and joins the South. Okay. Now, I told you in class at face value, Davis looks like a good choice as president of the Confederacy. Unfortunately, he has very, very poor leadership. Okay. He wanted to micromanage everything, which is very, very difficult. All right. Especially when you're pursuing a war. Like he wanted his generals to run all their plans by him. Okay. Which you can't do in the heat of battle. Okay. You can't send telegrams back to the president and wait for the president to respond. Davis wanted to approve all military actions before they went out. You can't do that. Sometimes when you fight, you got to move at the spur of the moment, okay? So because of that poor leadership, the Union Army is able to coordinate multiple lethal blows at numerous locations at the same time. And critics are going to criticize Davis's leadership during the war, and that's going to help contribute to the eventual defeat of the Confederacy in a lot of historians' eyes. Okay. Richmond will be burned. Grant is going to lay siege to Richmond. The Confederates evacuate, burning the city behind them. Davis and his cabinet are going to escape to Danville, okay, where they will be captured eventually. All right. Davis is sent to prison in Virginia at a place called Fort Monroe. It's a great historic site. If you get a chance to go to Fort Monroe, you can see the cell that Davis was imprisoned in. They thought he might have had a role in the assassination of Lincoln. Of course, he's the president of this country that has rebelled against the United States. So Davis was in prison for a long time because we were trying to figure out what to do with him. Do we put him on trial as a traitor? Is he involved in Lincoln's assassination? What do we do? All right. He will eventually be freed and sent back to Mississippi, and he will live out his days in Mississippi after being imprisoned at the end of the Civil War. Now, one of Davis's most ablest commander, in fact, one of the ablest commanders of the Confederacy, is Robert E. Lee. Okay. Robert E. Lee was born in Virginia in 1807 in Stratford, right? And you can still visit his birthplace today. He also goes to West Point. He serves with distinction in the Mexican-American War. He's an engineer. He makes the Army his career. And unlike General Grant, Lee has one of the most perfect records at West Point. He has, in fact, if memory serves me correct, he has no demerits. Okay, he does nothing wrong during his time at West Point. All right. He also has an interesting connection to George Washington. He married the step great granddaughter of George Washington. Okay, Mary Custis. Mary Custis's dad, George Washington Parke Custis, was George Washington's adopted grandson. Okay, Washington had no children. When he married Martha, he adopted Martha's children from her previous marriage. Okay, so Washington had no legitimate children of his own. He had stepchildren. So Lee marries Mary Custis, who is the step great granddaughter of George Washington. As such, Lee inherits Arlington House. Arlington House is in DC, is in Arlington. It's really close to DC. If you've ever been to Arlington National Cemetery, it's the big house. It's called the Lee Mansion. It sits on top of the hill. Okay. Lee at one point in time owned that house. He inherited it when his father-in-law passes away. His father-in-law had intended that house to become a museum to George Washington. So there's a lot of artifacts in the Lee family that once belonged to George Washington because Lee's father-in-law was the adopted grandson of George Washington. So there's this big connection with George Washington. The Lee family is going to lose that house in the course of the Civil War. They are seen as traitors. It is kind of seized by the U.S. government. And one of the Union generals, actually the Union quartermaster Montgomery Meigs, decides if the Lee family gets this house back, they will have to deal with the remainders of the war. So he begins burying Union dead in what he calls Mrs. Lee's Rose Garden, which is how Arlington Cemetery comes about. Okay. After the war, the Lees petitioned to try to get the mansion back, but the Union government, the national government, never give it back to them. Okay. Now, during the course of the Civil War, Lee, at the beginning of the war, served in the Union Army. In fact, Lincoln offered him command of the Union Army, the Union forces, but Lee says, I cannot fight against my home. I cannot fight against Virginia. Okay. So he did not favor slavery. He did not believe in slavery. He did not favor secession, but he was loyal to his state, Virginia. Okay. So Lincoln offers him command in the Union Army. Lee says no. After Virginia secedes, I can't fight against my home. So he joins the Confederate Army. Now, at the beginning, Jefferson Davis will not give him an active commission. I told you Lee was an engineer. He was also quartermaster. So Jefferson Davis thinks he's more valuable in those roles. Okay. So at the beginning of the war, Lee does not have an active commission. He will eventually go on to become the lead general of the Army of Northern Virginia. And there are a bunch of other armies in the Confederate Army, but this becomes the main body. Okay, so when Lee surrenders in April 1865, even though there are other Confederate forces out there, when Lee surrenders, for all intents and purposes, the war is over. Okay. He is an aggressive military general. He's very well respected by his men. He's also very well respected by the North as well because he is a gentleman. All right. In fact, there's a story that when the Confederate Army invades Pennsylvania, all these Pennsylvania women come out to see Lee go by, and one of them whispers, I wish he was ours, namely, I wish he was on our side. Like I said, he will be the general to surrender. He's one of the most beloved generals in the South. He's actually a well-respected general in military history. He will surrender to Grant in 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse, and when he surrenders, for all intents and purposes, the war is over. There is serious discussion about putting him under arrest. All right, he's not quite sure what's going to happen to him, but he's not imprisoned like Jefferson Davis was after the war. He will eventually wind up in Lexington, Virginia. He is invited to become president of a struggling institution known as Washington College. Washington College came about because of land granted to them by George Washington. So they named the college after George Washington. Lee comes to become president of that. He hires a bunch of new faculty. He revitalizes the course offerings. He attracts a lot of students from both the North and the South because people want to go to Mr. Lee's college. And when Lee passes away in 1870, they will rename the college in his honor, Washington and Lee University. Okay. And the number of programs that are existent there today are due in part to Lee's leadership as president of that college. Now, he is buried on the campus at Washington Lee University in Lee Chapel. Now, one of his most able commanders and subordinates is Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson. Jackson was born in 1824 in Virginia. He goes to West Point, very, very lucky to go to West Point. To go to West Point, you need to have a recommendation from your state senator. There are only so many spots open at West Point. One of the spots from Virginia, Jackson had applied and another gentleman had applied. That gentleman got the spot. So there was a chance that Jackson wasn't going to go to West Point. All right. Then that other gentleman decides to back out and Jackson gets his spot. All right. When he enters West Point, he struggles. He's kind of at the bottom of his class, but he's another one that over the course of 4 years, he works his way up to the head, to very, very close to the head of the class. In fact, his classmates say if it had been a 5-year program instead of a 4-year program, he would have been the top of his class the following year. Okay. He goes on to become a professor at the Virginia Military Institute. He's the artillery instructor. He also teaches math and applied science. He is a terrible, terrible teacher. He memorizes all of his lectures the night before and goes in and recites them verbatim in class. If you had a question, he would go back to the point in the lecture where he thought he would answer it and start all over again. Right? But on the artillery field, he was a totally different person. He was animated. He was encouraging his kids. Students that couldn't stand him in class, when they got out on the artillery field with him, loved him. They thought he was great. Okay. He will be a professor at VMI when Virginia secedes. Like Lee, he does not own slaves. He does not really particularly care for slavery. He does not like secession. But when Virginia leaves, he goes with Virginia. Another thing, in Lexington, he taught a Sunday school class for freed slaves. And this was at a time where teaching a white person teaching black people could get you in trouble. And he was advocating that slaves learn to read because they needed to learn to read the Bible. Okay. So he is kind of progressive in that way. He was teaching this Sunday school class for slaves in Lexington before the war. We talked about in class at the Battle of First Bull Run, he gets the nickname Stonewall. General Bernard B. says, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." Jackson had brought his troops up from VMI. He places them in battle. We talked about the fact we don't know if Bernard B. is being complimentary or being derogatory, because right after he says it, B is shot in the mouth and dies. But that nickname is going to stick with Jackson through the end of the war. He is also very, very aggressive, kind of like Sherman and Grant. Jackson and Lee just work really well together. And anything Lee gives Jackson to do, Jackson does. Okay. Jackson will die after the Battle of Chancellorsville. He is mortally wounded by his own troops. Okay. There was a regiment of troops from North Carolina. Jackson had pushed the Union Army. It's in May of 1863. Jackson had pushed the Union Army early in the morning and was out investigating his lines at night. It was raining. He realized that he had rode out too far. He was actually in the Union territory. So he and his troops began to head back toward the Confederate lines. Like I said, it was dark, it was raining. Jackson was wearing a dark raincoat over his uniform. And as he and his group approached these troops from North Carolina, they think it is Union troops and they open fire. Okay. Jackson is struck in the right hand as well as the left shoulder and the left hand as well. He falls from his horse and hits the cold, muddy ground. And basically, pneumonia sets in. He has to have his left arm amputated. Things look like they are going well, but then that pneumonia sets in, and Jackson will die in May of 1863. After he had his arm amputated, Robert E. Lee said he has lost his left arm, but I've lost my right. Okay, meaning the right hand is the dependable one. Jackson and Lee worked well together. Lee is saying, who can I find to replace Jackson? Okay, he's my right arm. I could always depend on him. All right. Um, he will die May of 1863. His body will be brought back to Lexington because that's where he lived. That's where he taught before the war. He is also buried in Lexington, very, very close to Robert E. Lee, his commanding general. Lee, like I said, is at Lee Chapel on the campus of Washington Lee University. Jackson is buried in what right now is called Stonewall Jackson Memorial Cemetery, but my understanding is they are going to rename that something else. I think it's either going to be Lexington Presbyterian Cemetery or something like that. But Jackson is there right in the center of the cemetery, big statue over his grave. So if you're ever in Lexington, visit both Washington and Lee, VMI, and Jackson's grave in the center of town. So those are some people of the Civil War. Like I said, there are more people I would like to talk about. I would like to go into more detail with these guys, but that's just a brief overview of 3 key Union people and 3 key Confederate people.